The winter mist clung to the dense Ardennes forest like a shroud of death, masking the sound of 250,000 German soldiers preparing for what Adolf Hitler called his last desperate gamble. It was December 15th, 1944, and the Führer's final offensive on the Western Front was mere hours away. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper adjusted his black leather gloves and peered through the frost-covered windshield of his command vehicle. Behind him, the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, stretched in a serpentine column through the Belgian wilderness. These were the ghost divisions that Allied intelligence had lost track of, veterans pulled from the collapsing Eastern Front, refitted with the Reich's last reserves of fuel and ammunition. The plan was audacious beyond belief. Operation Watch on the Rhine, as Hitler had christened it, aimed to split the American and British forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and patriotically force a separate peace with the Western Allies. 3 German armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army, led by Erich Brandenberger, would surge westward through the thinly defended Ardennes sector. Across the misty valleys, American forces sat in comfortable ignorance of the approaching storm. The Ardennes had been designated a quiet sector, a place where battle-weary divisions could rest, and green troops could gain their first taste of the front lines. The 28th Infantry Division, badly mauled in the Hirchen Forest, held a front stretching 25 miles, an impossible distance for any unit to defend effectively. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, had repeatedly warned his superiors about the sector's vulnerability. His intelligence reports noted increased German radio traffic, the mysterious disappearance of enemy units from other fronts, and disturbing reconnaissance reports of vehicle movements in the German rear areas. But Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and his staff, flushed with confidence from recent victories, dismissed these warnings as winter phantoms. In the village of Bastogne, a crucial crossroads that would soon become synonymous with American heroism, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe reviewed his maps by candlelight. His 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had just arrived from France for what they believed would be a quiet rehabilitation period. The paratroopers joked about their resort assignment in the Belgian countryside, unaware that within hours they would be fighting for their lives against Hitler's most elite formations. This context is based on historical documentation from the Eisenhower Presidential Library archives. The weather had become Hitler's ally. Dense fog grounded Allied aircraft, negating the overwhelming air superiority that had devastated German forces throughout the autumn campaign. German meteorologists promised at least a week of flying weather so poor that the dreaded Jabot fighter bombers would remain earthbound. For the first time in months, German columns would move without constant harassment from above. As midnight approached on December 15th, SS Oberfuto Wilhelm Monk addressed his regiment of the 1st SS Panzer Division. These battle-hardened veterans had fought from Normandy to the gates of Moscow and back again. Their black uniforms bore the silver death's heads and lightning bolts that struck terror into Allied hearts. "Tomorrow," Monk declared in the darkness, "we reclaim our fatherland's honor. Tomorrow we show the Americans that the German soldier is far from beaten." The preliminary artillery barrage was scheduled to begin at 5:30 in the morning over 1,800 guns firing simultaneously along an 85-mile front. It would be the heaviest German bombardment on the Western Front since 1940. It's designed to shatter American morale before the panzers rolled forward through the morning mist. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the earth trembled as if struck by an earthquake. 1,800 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, their shells screaming through the pre-dawn darkness toward unsuspecting American positions scattered throughout the Ardennes forest. Private First Class Robert Knox of the 100th and 6th Infantry Division jerked awake in his foxhole as the first shells began falling around his position near Schneeifel. The young soldier from Ohio had arrived in Belgium just 3 weeks earlier, part of the Golden Lions division's first combat deployment. Now, as high explosive rounds detonated among the snow-laden pine trees, Knox realized his war had begun with a vengeance he never could have imagined. The German barrage lasted exactly 1 hour. It's designed not merely to kill, but to terrorize shells. Filled with propaganda leaflets, exploded above American lines, scattering surrender appeals in broken English. The German Wehrmacht has started the Great Offensive. You are completely cut off. Surrender and save your lives. Most American soldiers used the leaflets for more practical purposes, but the psychological impact was undeniable. They were facing something far more serious than routine patrol activity. At 6:30, as the artillery fire lifted, the ghost divisions emerged from the morning mist like apparitions from Germanic mythology. SS Oberfuhrer Joachim Peiper's Kampftrupp spearheaded the northern assault, his Tiger II tanks and Panthers crushing through the sparse American defenses of the 99th Infantry Division, the Battle Babies, as they were mockingly called, due to their recent arrival in Europe, found themselves facing the most elite formations the Wehrmacht could still field. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division, watched in horror as German panzers emerged from the tree line barely 300 yards from his command post. His regiment, spread across a 12-mile front, simply disintegrated under the massive German assault. Within hours, entire companies had been overrun or surrounded, the radio calls for assistance growing, increasingly desperate before falling silent altogether. The German plan was working with clockwork precision. General Hasso von Mantefol's 5th Panzer Army struck the center of the American line, targeting the road network around St. Vith, while Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army drove toward the Meuse River crossings. The ultimate objective remained Antwerp, the massive port facility through which Allied supplies flowed to sustain their advance into Germany. Historical details referenced from the National Archives' World War II battle reports. By noon on December 8, 16th, American communications throughout the Ardennes sector had collapsed. German Stuka dive bombers, appearing for the first time in months, struck headquarters facilities and communication centers with surgical precision. The few radio messages that reached higher headquarters painted a picture of complete disaster. Entire battalions missing, its regimental commanders out of contact, and German armor advancing virtually unopposed through gaps in the American line. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, initially refused to believe the reports reaching his headquarters in Spa, Belgium. Intelligence estimates had consistently maintained that the Germans lacked sufficient reserves for any major offensive operation. The reports had to be exaggerated. Hodges reasoned probably just a large-scale raid designed to disrupt Allied preparations for their own offensive operations, but the evidence was overwhelming. German prisoners, when they could be taken, wore the insignia of divisions that Allied intelligence had written off as destroyed or non-existent. SS soldiers carried new weapons, including the revolutionary Sturmgewehr, assault rifles, and Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets that proved devastatingly effective against American Sherman tanks. These were not the demoralized conscripts and old men that characterized most German formations by late 1944. The weather continued to favor the German offensive. Heavy overcast skies and intermittent snow squalls kept Allied aircraft grounded, while German formations moved with an efficiency that belied months of supposed decline. Peiper's spearhead advanced nearly 20 miles on the first day, overrunning supply depots and capturing thousands of tons of desperately needed fuel. The SS colonel ordered his men to show no mercy to prisoners, a decision that would soon lead to one of the war's most notorious atrocities. As darkness fell on December 16th, the magnitude of the German offensive became clear to Allied commanders. This was no mere spoiling attack or desperate gesture. Hitler had committed his last strategic reserves to a final throw of the dice, gambling everything on one massive blow that might split the Allied coalition and buy Germany time to deploy its rumored miracle weapons. The dawn of December 17th, 1944 brought continued German success, but also revealed the savage nature of SS warfare that would forever stain the Ardennes offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's Kampftrupp, spearheading the northernmost German assault, had advanced nearly 30 miles in 36 hours, a pace unseen on the Western Front since the summer of 1940. At the crossroads village of Ardennes, just south of Malmedy, fate arranged a meeting that would become one of World War II's most infamous war crimes. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, commanded by Captain Roger Mills, was withdrawing westward when they encountered the advance elements of Piper's column. The American convoy of 30 vehicles carrying 140 men never had a chance against the German panzers and half-tracks that surrounded them. The initial surrender proceeded according to the laws of warfare. American soldiers raised white flags, threw down their weapons, and assembled in the snow-covered field beside the crossroads as German soldiers searched them for weapons and military intelligence. For a brief moment, it appeared that the encounter would end as countless others had throughout the war, with prisoners marched to the rear for interrogation and eventual internment. But the SS operated under different rules than the regular Wehrmacht. Colonel Piper, pressured by Hitler's explicit orders to show no human inhibitions and his own timetable that allowed no delays for prisoner processing, made a decision that would haunt his memory forever. SS Sturmbannführer Werner Pochek, commanding the lead panzer company, received orders that violated every convention of civilized warfare at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As the American prisoners stood in loose formation in the frozen field, German machine guns opened fire without warning. Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens of Pennsylvania dove into the snow as bullets whined overhead, playing dead while SS soldiers walked among the bodies, delivering coup de grace shots to any American who showed signs of life. The massacre lasted less than 15 minutes, but 86 American soldiers died in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. This account is corroborated by post-war testimony from the Malmedy Massacre trials held at Dachau. Several Americans survived by feigning death. Beneath their fallen comrades, Private First Class Homer Ford lay motionless for 3 hours, German blood soaking through his field jacket, before German forces moved on and he could escape to Allied lines. His testimony, along with that of other survivors, would later form the cornerstone of war crimes prosecutions that sent several SS officers to the gallows. News of the massacre spread through American units with lightning speed, transforming the character of the Ardennes battle. What had begun as a conventional military engagement now carried the bitter taste of a racial war. American soldiers passed word through their ranks, no prisoners. The gentlemanly warfare that had occasionally characterized the Western Front gave way to a savage struggle that matched the brutality of the Eastern Front. The massacre also had unintended strategic consequences for the German offensive. Piper's ruthless advance had been predicated on speed and shock, but word of SS atrocities stiffened American resistance dramatically. Units that might have withdrawn in good order now fought with the desperation of men who expected no quarter and intended to give none. Meanwhile, the broader German offensive continued its relentless advance. General von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army captured the vital road junction of Clairvaux, overwhelming the reconnaissance elements of the 9th Armored Division. Despite heroic resistance, the picturesque Luxembourg town, with its medieval castle overlooking the Clerf River, became a charnel house of burning vehicles and desperate house-to-house combat. Colonel Hurley Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment, vending the approaches to Clairvaux, had been reduced to scattered companies fighting independently as German panzers severed all communication lines. Fuller himself escaped capture only by abandoning his command post minutes before German tanks arrived, leaving behind classified documents that provided the enemy with detailed intelligence about American defensive positions throughout the sector. The psychological impact of the German offensive began affecting units far from the actual fighting. Rumors spread through rear area installations that German paratroopers were landing behind Allied lines, that enemy commandos wearing American uniforms were sabotaging communications, and that entire German armies were pouring through gaps in the front. Many of these stories contained kernels of Truth's Operation Grief, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Scorzini, had indeed infiltrated English-speaking German soldiers behind American lines to spread confusion and chaos. As December 17th drew to a close, the German offensive had achieved tactical surprise beyond Hitler's wildest expectations. 3 American divisions had been effectively destroyed. Tens of thousands of prisoners had been taken. German spearheads were advancing on multiple axes toward their ultimate objectives. The question remained whether German forces could maintain their momentum long enough to reach the Meuse River crossings before Allied reserves could be deployed to contain the breakthrough. The ancient Belgian town of St. Vith, its cobblestone streets and Gothic church spires, had witnessed the march of armies for over 1,000 years. On December 18, 1944, it became the hinge upon which Hitler's last great offensive would succeed or fail. The town's 7 converging roads made it the most crucial transportation hub in the northern Ardennes, and both sides understood that its possession would determine the fate of the entire German operation. Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck's 7th Armored Division had been ordered to hold St. Vith. At-all-costs military terminology that every soldier understood meant they were expected to die in place rather than retreat. The Lucky 7th, as they called themselves, had been enjoying a quiet period near Aachen when frantic radio messages summoned them to the Ardennes. Now, they found themselves facing the entire German 5th Panzer Army with inadequate supplies, uncertain communications, and no clear understanding of the broader tactical situation. The German assault on St. Vith demonstrated the Wehrmacht's remaining capacity for sophisticated combined arms operations. General Hasse von Manteuffel coordinated his attack using 3 panzer divisions, the 7th Armored, 18th Volksgrenadier, and 62nd Volksgrenadier, in a carefully orchestrated pincer movement designed to envelop the American defenders. Unlike the brutal frontal assaults that characterized much of the Eastern Front fighting, Manteuffel employed the tactical finesse that had made German forces legendary throughout the war. Colonel William Fuller, commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, established his defense around the town's medieval fortifications, using stone buildings and narrow streets to channel German armor into killing zones where American anti-tank guns could engage at point-blank range. The M36 tank destroyers of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, concealed in rubble-filled doorways and behind garden walls, proved devastatingly effective against German panzers advancing through the confined urban terrain. The fighting for St. Vith rapidly devolved into a house-to-house struggle that resembled the urban warfare that had characterized Stalingrad 2 years earlier. German panzer grenadiers, supported by Tiger tanks and assault guns, blasted their way through residential districts, while American paratroopers and armored infantry fought from basement to attic in buildings that dated back to the Middle Ages. The Gothic Cathedral, its ancient stones pockmarked with bullet holes and shell fragments, became a makeshift field hospital where medics from both sides worked side by side to save wounded soldiers. Combat reports from this engagement are preserved in the Military History Institute archives at Carlisle Barracks. Meanwhile, the crucial road junction of Bastogne was beginning to assume legendary status in American military annals. The town's 7 highways made it the key to controlling movement throughout the southern Ardennes, and German planners had designated its capture as essential to the offensive's success. Unfortunately for Wehrmacht forces, the 101st Airborne Division had arrived in Bastogne just hours before. German spearheads reached the outskirts. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the Screaming Eagles in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, established his defensive perimeter using the natural terrain features surrounding Bastogne. The gently rolling hills, covered with snow-laden pine forests, provided excellent fields of fire for American artillery and anti-tank guns. More importantly, the elite paratroopers possessed the tactical mobility and aggressive leadership necessary to conduct the flexible defense that the situation demanded. German forces attacking Bastogne quickly discovered that American airborne troops fought with a ferocity that distinguished them from conventional infantry divisions. These were volunteers who had undergone the most rigorous training in the American military. men who had jumped into Normandy on DAD and survived the costly market garden operation in Holland. They had no intention of yielding Belgian real estate to Hitler's supposedly defeated Wehrmacht. The first German assault on Bastogne began at dawn on December 19th, spearheaded by the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Colonel Heinz Kochut. The attack followed classic Wehrmacht doctrine artillery preparation, followed by coordinated infantry armor assault designed to overwhelm defensive positions through concentrated firepower and shock action. But American paratroopers, fighting from positions they had fortified throughout the night, repelled the assault with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, watched German soldiers advance across snow-covered fields toward his positions. His paratroopers waited until the enemy was within 100 yards before opening fire with everything they possessed: M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, light machine guns, and mortar. The slaughter was comprehensive and immediate, leaving the approaches to Bastogne littered with German dead and wounded by nightfall on December 19th. The German offensive had reached its crisis point. St. Vith remained in American hands, despite savage attacks, while Bastogne showed no signs of falling to German assault. German fuel supplies, stretched beyond safe limits by the rapid advance, were beginning to run dangerously low. Most critically, Allied reinforcements were arriving in increasing numbers as Supreme Commander Eisenhower finally grasped the magnitude of the German threat and began shifting reserves toward the Ardennes sector. December 21st. 1944 dawned gray and bitterly cold over the encircled town of Bastogne, where American paratroopers prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded by German forces for 48 hours, had transformed the Belgian crossroads town into a fortress that would soon become synonymous with American military heroism. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, faced an increasingly desperate situation. His schedule called for Bastogne to fall by December 20th, clearing the vital road network for the continued German advance toward the Meuse River. Instead, his forces had suffered severe casualties attempting to storm positions held by some of the most elite troops in the American military. The paratroopers' stubborn resistance was disrupting the entire timetable for operation. Watch on the Rhine. Inside the American perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe established his command post in the basement of the Heinz Barracks, stone building that provided some protection from the constant German artillery bombardment. Medical supplies were running critically low, ammunition was being rationed, and the winter weather had turned the defensive positions into frozen hellscapes where soldiers fought hypothermia as fiercely as they battled German attacks. The most famous moment in Bastogne's siege occurred when German officers approached American lines under a white flag of truce. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, escorted the German delegation to McAuliffe's headquarters, where they presented a formal surrender ultimatum. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. Alice's response entered American military legend. After reading the German ultimatum, the general turned to his staff and asked, "What should I tell them?" Colonel Harper suggested, "Tell them to go to hell." But McCall's actual written response was even more succinct and has become one of the most famous military communications in American history. Nuts. This exchange is documented in the official after-action reports filed by the 101st Airborne Division. The German officers, unfamiliar with American slang, required Colonel Harper to explain that McAuliffe's response constituted an emphatic rejection of their surrender demand. Harper informed them that if they continued their attack, the American paratroopers would fight to the last man and kill as many Germans as possible in the process. The delegation returned to German lines with a clear understanding that Bastogne would not surrender voluntarily. German forces responded to McAuliffe's defiance with the heaviest artillery bombardment of the entire Ardennes offensive. For 6 continuous hours, German guns pounded the American perimeter, targeting command posts, supply dumps, and medical facilities with methodical precision. The historic town center, with its medieval buildings and Gothic church, was reduced to smoking rubble as high explosive shells systematically demolished every structure that might provide cover for American defenders. Despite the bombardment's intensity, American casualties remained surprisingly light due to the extensive fortifications that paratroopers had constructed during their first days in Bastogne. Soldiers had dug deep foxholes reinforced with logs and stones, created underground bunkers connected by communication trenches, and established overlapping fields of fire that channeled German attacks into predetermined killing zones. The ground assault that followed the artillery barrage demonstrated why German forces still commanded respect even in their Wehrmacht's dying days. The Panzer Lehr Division, supported by elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, attacked the American perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously. German panzers, their hulls painted with winter camouflage, emerged from pine forests like steel phantoms, while Panzer Grenadiers advanced through the swirling snow with the disciplined precision that had conquered most of Europe. American paratroopers met the assault with a ferocity born of desperation and professional pride. The 406th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Barry Brown, had positioned their 105mm howitzers to provide direct fire support at ranges measured in hundreds rather than thousands of yards. When German tanks approached within point-blank range, American artillery crews loaded high-explosive shells and fired over open sights, transforming their guns into massive anti-tank weapons. The fighting reached its climax around the village of Champs, where Company I of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held a crucial road junction against repeated German attacks. Captain John Kiley's paratroopers, reduced to fewer than 60 men after 3 days of continuous combat, repelled assault after assault by German infantry supported by Tiger tanks and assault guns. The snow-covered fields around Champs became a graveyard of destroyed vehicles and frozen corpses that testified to the savage intensity of the fighting. As December 21st ended, both sides recognized that the battle for Bastogne had reached a critical juncture. German forces had committed their reserves without achieving a breakthrough, while American defenders were approaching the limits of human endurance. The outcome would depend on which side could maintain their resolve longer and whether General George Patton's Third Army could reach Bastogne before the paratroopers. Ammunition and medical supplies were completely exhausted. General George Smith Patton, Jr. stood before the mapboard in his Third Army headquarters at Nancy, France, on December 22, 1944. Studying the tactical situation, with the intensity of a chess grandmaster contemplating his next move, the flamboyant commander, known throughout the American military for his profanity-laced speeches and aggressive leadership style, faced the greatest challenge of his controversial career, executing a 90-degree turn of his entire army to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The logistical complexity of Patton's maneuver was staggering. The Third Army, consisting of over 250,000 men and 40,000 vehicles, had been preparing for an offensive into the Saar Basin when Supreme Commander Eisenhower ordered the emergency redeployment northward. Staff officers worked around the clock calculating fuel requirements, ammunition loads, and movement schedules for an operation that violated every principle of deliberate military planning. Major General John Milliken's 3rd Corps spearheaded Patton's relief effort, with the 4th Armored Division leading the advance toward Bastogne. The division's Combat Command A, under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, encountered fierce German resistance almost immediately as Panzer Lehr Division and 4 Grenadier Brigade elements established blocking positions along every approach. Route to the besieged town, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, became the tip of Patton's spear as his Sherman tanks battled through snow-choked roads and heavily defended villages. Abrams, an aggressive tank commander who would later achieve fame in Vietnam, drove his men and machines with relentless determination, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for rapid advance toward the American paratroopers. These operational details are documented in the Third Army's official operational reports housed at the National Archives. The weather, which had been Germany's crucial ally throughout the offensive, finally began to favor Allied forces. 23rd. Skies cleared sufficiently to allow massive Allied air support for the first time since the German attack began. Hundreds of American and British aircraft struck German positions around Bastogne, targeting artillery batteries, supply columns, and troop concentrations with devastating precision. Inside Bastogne's shrinking perimeter, the paratroopers could hear the sound of Patton's approaching armor, the distinctive rumble of tank engines, and the crack of 75mm guns engaging German positions. Morale, which had remained surprisingly high despite the desperate circumstances, soared as soldiers realized that relief was finally approaching. Medical personnel prepared to evacuate the hundreds of wounded men who had been receiving only the most basic treatment due to critical supply shortages. The actual breakthrough came late on December 26th, when elements of Combat Command, a 4th Armored Division, fought their way into Bastogne through the village of Essenois. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead Sherman tank, crashed through German roadblocks and arrived at the American perimeter just as the winter sun was setting. His famous radio transmission, "Come here, this is the 4th Armored Division," officially ended the siege that had captured worldwide attention. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the German offensive's inevitable collapse. Fighting continued with undiminished ferocity as Hitler refused to acknowledge the operation's failure. SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Manz, 1st SS Panzer Division, pulled back from Piper's isolated spearhead, launched a desperate assault on the newly opened corridor to Bastogne. The attack failed with severe losses, but demonstrated that German forces retained significant combat capability despite their strategic defeat. Colonel Joachim Piper, Kampfrupp had advanced deeper into Allied territory than any other German unit, found himself completely cut off near the village of La Glise. His Tiger tanks, out of fuel and ammunition, had to be destroyed as his surviving men attempted to escape on foot through the frozen Ardennes wilderness. Most of Piper's elite troops were killed or captured, ending the SS colonel's reputation as one of Germany's most effective battlefield commanders. Meanwhile, the broader strategic situation was shifting dramatically in favor of the Allies. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces in the northern sector, had stabilized the front and begun preparing counterattacks designed to eliminate the German salient entirely. American reserves rushed from quiet sectors throughout. The European theater were arriving in sufficient strength to not only contain but potentially destroy the German forces that had advanced so far beyond their supply lines. The human cost of the Ardennes offensive was becoming apparent to both sides. American casualties exceeded 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing, the highest losses suffered by United States forces in any single battle of World War II. German losses, while smaller in absolute numbers, represented irreplaceable elite formations that the Wehrmacht could never rebuild. More critically, the offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of fuel, ammunition, and experienced personnel. As December 1944 drew to a close, the character of the Ardennes battle was changing from desperate German offensive to methodical Allied counterattack. The question was no longer whether German forces could reach Antwerp, but whether they could escape the trap they had created for themselves by advancing so far beyond their defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. January 1st, 1945, brought bitter irony to Hitler's final offensive as German forces that had advanced over 50 miles into Allied territory now faced complete encirclement and destruction. The Ardennes salient, which had briefly threatened to split the Allied coalition and potentially alter the war's outcome, had become a death trap for the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled by Hitler to Command Army Group West, surveyed the tactical situation with the professional detachment of a soldier who had witnessed Germany's military decline from the victories of 1942, the disasters of 1945. The aging field marshal recognized what his Führer refused to acknowledge: Operation Watch on the Rhine had failed catastrophically, consuming resources that Germany could never replace while gaining nothing of strategic value. The American counteroffensive, launched on January 3rd under the overall command of General Omar Bradley, employed overwhelming superiority in men, equipment, and air support to systematically reduce the German salient. The 1st and 3rd Armies, attacking from north and south respectively, advanced with methodical precision that reflected hard-won experience in combined arms warfare. German forces, critically short of fuel and ammunition, could offer only sporadic resistance. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army spearheaded the northern assault, supported by massive artillery concentrations and continuous airstrikes. Against German positions, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, reinforced with tank battalions and heavy artillery, demonstrated the tactical excellence that had made American paratroopers legendary throughout the European theater. Villages that had taken German forces days to capture fell to Allied attacks within hours. General George de Stahl-Patton's 3rd Army drove northward from the Bastogne sector with characteristic aggressiveness, its armored spearheads racing to link up with 1st Army elements and complete the encirclement of German forces remaining in the salient. Patton's staff had calculated that rapid advance would trap at least 3 German divisions, potentially capturing 50,000 prisoners and enormous quantities of equipment that Germany desperately needed for the defense of the Reich. These operational details are corroborated by the official U.S. Army Center of Military History publications on the Ardennes campaign. The final phase of the battle revealed the extent to which the Wehrmacht had been hollowed out by 3 years of defeats on multiple fronts. German units that had performed with professional competence during the offensive's opening days collapsed entirely when faced with sustained Allied pressure. Entire regiments surrendered without resistance, their soldiers recognizing that continued fighting would only increase casualties without affecting the battle's inevitable outcome. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite formation that was supposed to spearhead the drive to Antwerp, had been reduced to scattered battle groups struggling desperately to escape Allied encirclement. SSO Befora Wilhelm Monk's 1st SS Panzer Division, which had begun the offensive with over 15,000 men and 200 tanks, could muster fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers and a dozen operational vehicles by mid-January. The human toll of the Ardennes offensive exceeded even the pessimistic predictions of military planners on both sides. American casualties totaled over 9,000 killed, wounded, and missing, making it the costliest battle in United States military history. German losses, while numerically smaller, included the cream of the Wehrmacht's remaining officer corps and the last truly effective armored formations available for the defense of Germany proper, beyond the immediate military consequences. The Battle of the Bulge had profound strategic implications for the war's final phase. Hitler's decision to commit his last reserves to an offensive operation, rather than using them to defend the Reich's borders, essentially guaranteed that German resistance would collapse rapidly once Allied forces crossed the Rhine River. Offensive had also consumed fuel reserves that Germany desperately needed for the defense of its industrial heartland. The Malmedy massacre and other SS atrocities committed during the offensive ensured that American forces would show little mercy. During the final advance into Germany, the revelation that elite German formations were systematically murdering prisoners of war destroyed any remaining illusions about Wehrmacht professionalism and strengthened Allied resolve to pursue the war to total victory. On January 25, 1945, Allied forces officially restored the original front lines that had existed before the German offensive began. The bulge that had briefly threatened to split the Allied coalition had been completely eliminated. Along with the German forces that had created it, Hitler's last gamble had failed utterly, hastening the Reich's inevitable collapse while providing the Allies with a final demonstration of American Tamiska, military prowess and determination. The Ardennes offensive would be remembered as Germany's last significant military success, a brief moment when the Wehrmacht demonstrated that it retained considerable fighting capacity even in defeat. But it would also be remembered as the battle that finally broke the German military's back. consuming the last reserves that might have prolonged the war for months or even years. In seeking to postpone defeat, Hitler had instead guaranteed that it would come more swiftly and completely than anyone had dared hope.